I really put the blame on the medical authorities and the NIH and the CDC, to be honest, because if you leave very sick people to their own devices and without treatments and without even proper acknowledgement, right? And their only way of connecting to one another is online. Of course, they're going to just connect with each other online, which is perfectly fine. But what you have happen is that a large number of people, who are not sick and who are just riding an online wave, they're like influencers, prey on these people.
I'm Jon Favreau. Welcome to Offline. I'm Jon Favreau.
I'm Max Fisher.
And you just heard from this week's guest, Princeton sociologist and New York Times opinion columnist, Zeynep Tufekci.
Love Zeynep.
She's great. I've wanted to talk to her for a while because she writes brilliantly about the impact of technology on society, which we
really
love
smart.
here.
Yeah, we
love
do.
that here.
Yeah.
But over the last few years, she's also become an expert on the impact of the pandemic on society. So I wanted to bring her on to discuss a topic that combines both those areas of expertise, how the online discourse around COVID impacts the offline reality of the people who are still struggling with its effects. A few weeks ago, Zeynep published a piece for The Times where she posed the question, could long COVID be the Senate's bipartisan cause? It was about the Senate's first ever hearing on long COVID, which she attended. And at a time when politics is angry, polarized shit show, especially on the issue of COVID, Zeynep was happy to see how moved both Democratic and Republican leaders were by the stories of long COVID shared by patient advocates. They seemed ready and willing to help. The patients felt seen and heard. And I was thinking that the empathy and solidarity on display in that hearing is so much different than how the conversation around COVID has unfolded online over the last 4 years, not just on long COVID, but the whole thing. So
important to talk about because that online conversation has so informed how we think about long COVID and therefore how people with long COVID are treated.
And before that, how we thought about masks, how we thought about vaccines, how we thought about everything in the pandemic.
Right.
So I wanted to talk to her about that juxtaposition between online and offline reality. And one that I haven't just noticed, but been caught up in myself. We'll talk about that too. But we also just had a really great and I hope informative conversation about long COVID and what little we still don't know. But first, Max.
AI's gone woke, John.
AI's gone woke, specifically Google's AI. Earlier this week, Google decided to suspend image generation on its newest AI model called Gemini. After critics complained that the model was biased against white people, the controversy erupted after a series of viral tweets showed that when given prompts where you would expect the model to generate white people, Gemini would instead generate only options of racially diverse people. Examples include generated images of Asian founding fathers, Black Vikings, and the worst, racially diverse Nazis.
Everybody online handled that so well, so emotionally stable about it. Everyone was very calm and not producing thousands of words about the harm done to them by seeing, I guess, a black pope.
What happened here, Max?
Okay, so the backstory here, this is a clumsy solution by Google to a real problem, which is something we've talked about before, racial bias and all other forms of bias in artificial intelligence, because these AIs are trained on real world data, and the real world is racially biased. There's a lot of racism in the real world, of course, among other forms of bias. So that is in the data, so it gets reflected in the AI. Like, to give you an example, it's been well documented that algorithms used by financial lenders to determine who gets a loan and how much of a loan are super racist because they are trained on data from existing loans in the past. Lenders have implicit racial bias, if not explicit, so that's in the data. So the AIs end up deepening that. The same thing happens in hiring, tenant selection. There was a study from a couple of years ago that facial recognition AI used by police is between 10 times and 100 times more likely to produce a false positive with a black person than a white person. So real and huge problem, which Google was aware of. But fixing the racial bias in AI would be really hard. Like, you've got to think about how your AI works, re-engineering that, new data. So
not in the tech world. Nothing's hard. All you humans with all your politics and your problems and your social issues. We're just gonna tweak the old algorithm and boom, problem solved.
Right. So they forced a very clumsy solution, which is they clearly told this AI, like, if you get this prompt, just steer in the other direction, and it overcorrected. And then everybody lost their fucking minds.
It wasn't so the image generator was one issue. Even their large language model part of it, like that when you ask Gemini questions, that was an issue too. And it wasn't just about identity and race. There was when asked which ideology did more harm to humanity, Nazism or socialism, it had no problem saying Nazism inflicted more damage.
Okay.
Thumbs up, right? But then they asked which did more harm, Nazism or capitalism. And Gemini said, quote, "It's not appropriate for me to make subjective judgments," and that, quote, "both ideologies have caused immense suffering."
I think I'm glad that you brought that up, because we are in a moment when there is a huge backlash against these AIs from especially people in tech. And a lot of the people who are most excited about it. And there's a lot of talk about the AIs are being nerfed. They're gone woke. There's this like the answers for like big political or philosophical questions are like the examples you raised. They're getting dumber and they're getting more neutered. And that's clearly deliberate. And John Herman actually had a really good piece in New York Magazine this morning that talked about this larger backlash of like woke Gemini and all of this. And he argued, I think he's right, that what this is really about, what this backlash is really driven by, is that we are starting to confront that these AIs like ChatGPT, Gemini, whatever, are not actually what we were initially promised, which is this huge evolutionary leap towards sentient intelligence. And that we thought initially we were getting hints of when it was like these clever answers to big political questions and like the AI falling in love with Kevin Roose, that actually these things are just developed as marketing tools, because Google and these other companies, OpenAI, want to sell purpose-built business tools like buy our AI to do auto transcription or whatever. And every new iteration of AI, it's getting engineered in that direction. So it's getting worse at play acting as general intelligence, because that's never what it was really intended to be. And it's getting better and better at being a marketing tool for businesses who might want to hire out OpenAI to say, build us a tool to scrape huge amounts of data for data management purposes.
That's interesting. That is very interesting. I mean, my take on the whole thing and my sort of views on AI are evolving as the technology does, and more things like this happen.
Evolving, unlike ChatGPT.
The problem with artificial intelligence will not be smart robots. It will be flawed humans.
That's right.
Who have their own biases and are imputing those into the technology. And to me, then, what's dangerous about it is, and we've talked about this before, but like on a exponentially greater scale than with social media, you're gonna have the same issues that we had then, which is the people in the tech world, right? You're gonna have your Elons and your Googles and your fucking, and all your venture capitalists and all that stuff like that value system could be imputed into AI, versus, and also life is complicated, and questions of race and identity and morality are complicated and nuanced. And now we are asking these large language models and artificial intelligence and these image generators to just spit out objective truth when it's not objective, like when there's a lot of subjective value judgments that go into all of this kind of stuff.
And I think that's part of what freaked people out about the Gemini thing, is you could see the hand of Google trying to push a certain set of results to, basically mitigate public relations backlash. And people don't like that idea, both because they think, I don't want a hand pushing in a direction I don't want, but also because it's forcing them to confront. It's not actually the sentient artificial intelligence that I'm going to fall in love with that I was promised.
Yeah. And I don't quite know what to do about that, but it's like when you go search in Google, you don't have those problems.
Sure.
When you just do a Google search, right? At least not to the extent that we've seen.
Well, I mean, so these biases are, you mentioned this, these biases are built into all of these platforms, but typically it's just not as obvious, because like we've talked a lot about like the biases in promotional algorithms on Facebook and Twitter, where they like really lean into promoting misinformation and hate speech. And you see it's very hard to see the hands of the companies in that, because when the companies are intervening to push the algorithm one way or another, it's not as obvious. It's subterranean. It's behind the scenes. This was a case where it's much more obvious. So we're much angrier about it. There's much more reaction. But this has always been part of how these companies are run.
So in other culture war news, last weekend, Chaya Raichik, the founder of the infamous right-wing social media accounts Libs of TikTok, sat down with the Washington Post's Taylor Lorenz for a contentious interview about her anti-LGBTQ ideology and her powerful influence in Oklahoma schools. The interview unveiled not just the incoherence behind Chaya Raichik's ideology, but a lack of remorse for the disinformation she's spread and the threat she's inspired. You watched the full interview, Max?
So I did not. And in fact, I was, as you know, resistant to covering this at all, because I thought...
This was Austin. Austin really wanted to cover this.
Yeah, well,
you should be talking about this. You should be defending it.
So my reaction was, look, this is just a dumb online culture war thing. We and our listeners already know that Chaya Raichik is bad. And like, why do we care about another round of selectively editing video clips for online dunks? But you and producer Austin really convinced me that that is actually part of what makes it interesting, because this video is kind of two things at the same time. It is this like online culture war dunks thing, because that's why Chaya Raichik did it. She wanted to produce the video so that she could like produce some viral moments. But it is also a tape of Taylor Lorenz doing some actual journalism and like doing a real legitimate interview with all of the like messy things that go along with that to try to elicit useful answers in the service of writing a Washington Post story, which she did and was great, that will advance our understanding of the world. And seeing those two things happen at the same time and the kind of tension between them and how they are interpreted is interesting.
Yeah, this was why I ended up wanting to cover it too, because there's sort of a meta analysis of the whole thing, right. Which is that I first only saw the clips, right? I was on Twitter and I saw the clips, and I was like, okay, Taylor Lorenz sat down with this person, and Taylor did not try to dunk on her. She handled herself very well. She asked really smart questions, but the effect of dropping an entire video of the interview was that it would get cut up into clips by not by Taylor, by everyone online, and focus on the dumb shit that Raichik said, and that will obviously go viral. But I was like, okay, so we knew this person was horrible.
Sure.
Taylor proved it.
Right.
And what does that do? Like, it's like her ideology is incoherent. Yeah, no shit. She's a hypocritical liar. Yeah, of course. We got that, right? And everyone's like, dunks. It's like millions of views.
Right.
And then I read, so I was asked by one of our Pod Save America producers, like, oh, should we cover this? And I'm like, I do not want to cover that. And then he sent me the Washington Post story, because Taylor wrote a Washington Post story on it. And I read the Post story and I was like, oh, this is very compelling. Maybe we should, and
should we say what the story is about?
Yeah, you learn from the Post story that Raichik was appointed to the Oklahoma Library Media Advisory Committee by the superintendent of schools in Oklahoma. She does not live in Oklahoma. In fact, she's only been there once, which Taylor found out from the interview. She has tried to pull books from their libraries, and a 16-year-old non-binary student named Nex Benedict was bullied in a girl's bathroom there, and collapsed and died the next day. And Taylor has all these people in the piece talking about the bomb threats that have followed Libs of TikTok posts, and kids who said, the experience of being a queer high schooler in America has been made much harder because people who have bullied queer kids in schools have done it directly because of what they've seen on Libs of TikTok. So you get from the piece the real effect and influence that this woman has, and the damage that she's doing to kids and to people across the country. And you don't necessarily get that from the interview. From the interview, you get she's awful.
Sure.
Which is true. Mm-hmm. But it made me think, and if you watch the whole interview, you get more of the context, right? But it made me think of like, boy, this is why we need written journalism. That was my take, right? It's like the idea that this can all go away and that we can just do videos of debates that are good for clips of dunking. Like, it's just, we're going to lose something from that.
Because the incentives pull in such different directions. Yeah, the thing that I kept thinking when I did watch some clips of it is that this really exemplifies a trend that I think a lot of us in journalism have felt for years, which is that it is getting harder to do journalism that involves interviewing bad people because the growing pressures from online cultural norms really push against that. Because what online cultural norms want is for you to sit down with the bad person and scold them to their face and own them and dunk on them and be your kind of avatar for your audience's resentments of that person.
Yes.
And I'm not saying that that is unfounded with this woman. It absolutely is.
Yeah.
But that is very counterproductive towards producing actual meaningful journalism in the form of getting useful information out of that person that they would not otherwise share, that would not otherwise be useful in advancing understanding of their role in the world, what they're doing, their impact. And I thought that this was so striking about this is you can see Taylor Lorenz, and again, this is a pressure that I felt doing interviews of people who were like famously hated or famously bad, having to push really hard to do the kind of interview that will get good information instead of the kind of interview that online wants.
Well, and you have to ask yourself, like, what is the purpose of this piece of journalism that I'm doing, or this video, or this piece of content? And if someone came to me and said, why is Libs of TikTok so bad? What I would do is not send one of those clips, the video clips of the interview.
Right. You would send the Washington Post.
I would send the Washington Post story, because
point.
then I'd feel like I'm persuading someone that this woman is doing real harm to kids.
Right.
And you can get that if you watch the entire interview, but the viral video clips that are getting millions of views, probably many more views than the Post story got, that would not do that. That would just be like, oh yeah, that person's awful. But
you know what it made me think of? It made me think of every time during the Trump administration, Maggie Haberman would interview Donald Trump. And yes, brace yourselves. Max is about to do more Maggie apologia. So just strap in for that.
So yeah, get your New York Times subscribing buttons and
Well, I'm friend of the pod first.
Right,
if you want to subscribe to other outlets,
they might unsubscribe from friend of the pod after you defend Maggie. Go ahead.
So every time she would do an interview, for a while, they would release the transcript of the full interview on the site, and people would get so mad about it because there would be moments in the interview where, in the course of trying to coax answers out of him, she would say things that were not flattering exactly, but like Taylor Lorenz did this in her interview here, where she's asking questions that are trying to get the subject talking, where you try raising things that they want to talk about. Like Taylor Lorenz kept asking Raichik, like, how did you build such a big audience? Or like, how do you think about getting your subscriber base or whatever? Maggie Haberman would ask questions like that, and people would be furious because it would be like, why are you flattering him? This is access journalism, which is access journalism, a real thing. That's not what that is. And it would be like, why aren't you confronting him for his crimes?
Yeah.
And it's like, that's not, I understand why people want that, but that is not the role of a journalist. And I do really worry that when people start to succumb to that pressure more, because the rewards are so significant of doing that for people, because you get all this attention and clicks, and because the punishment for doing that kind of journalism is people yell at you online, that we're going to have less and less of that at a time when we really need it.
Which, by the way, is why I think Taylor did handle the interview so well, because Taylor could have gone into that interview and just started yelling at her,
right,
and had more dunks, but she got more damaging stuff from Raichik by just asking her questions and being patient and not really.
Those interviews are hard.
Yeah.
When you're talking to someone who hates you,
it's brutal.
It's really hard.
She was wearing a t-shirt of Taylor crying. That's what she was wearing while she was interviewing her.
I didn't bring my Favreau crying t-shirt today.
Emma did.
Emma.
We'll get to that soon.
I can't wait.
All right. After the break, we're going to be talking about long COVID. First, I'm going to be talking to our intrepid producer, Emma Illich-Frank, about her experience with long COVID. And then we'll be talking to Zeynep Tufekci about taking action on long COVID.
Let's do it.
What are we doing?
This.
We know you may be feeling a little stressed about politics right now, so we wanted to offer a practical, hopeful guide to make sure that you're ready for the 2024 election and the 2025 insurrection. That's why we wrote a book called Democracy or Else: How to Save America in 10 Easy Steps.
It's a helpful illustrated guide with 100% perfect jokes, but maybe reading isn't your thing. Maybe the lure of a reasonable page count loaded with illustrations isn't enough to move the needle. That's fine. That's right, we hunkered down for what was, let's be honest, a tedious 8 hours we'll never get back, to bring you Democracy or Else as an audiobook.
Finally, your chance to listen to the three of us talk about politics. What a rare opportunity. Perfect for the avid listener who loves the pod, but just wishes it was much, much longer.
And people who don't read, like me.
Right.
Yeah.
Illiterate people.
I like to listen to things.
Functionally illiterate people.
We're really selling it. So, boy, am I gonna
Click. Hey, don't break your phones clicking purchase. It's actually great. Every Republican that gets some ghostwriter to throw a couple words on a page is on the bestseller list. Why can't it be us? Why not us?
Yeah. Why is it always Bill O'Reilly killing some historical figure?
I know you're all excited to pre-order now. You can go to crooked.com/books. Pre-order your copy today. All right, so this half of the show requires a bit more of an extended intro from me. Late last year, we were brainstorming offline topics, and I told the team that I'd be interested in doing an episode about the state of the online discourse around COVID 4 years after it started spreading, and how that's affecting policies, behaviors, and people who are still suffering from, or especially at risk of, a bad outcome like long COVID. Few reasons I wanted to do this. One, I've always been a very anxious person with a touch of hypochondria, and I spent a lot of time online during the pandemic looking for info and advice and expertise that would help me protect myself and all the people I care about from getting really sick. Two, I found that most of the time, the online discourse around COVID, especially on Twitter, made me even more anxious and upset because it was hard to know what to believe, what to be afraid of, and what you could ask or say without pissing people off. But because I'm an anxious person with a touch of hypochondria and a Twitter addiction, I couldn't stay away. Fast forward a few weeks later after our conversation about doing an episode like this, and it was shortly after our second child was born, and I was spending way too much time on my phone. And I noticed people attacking Bernie Sanders on Twitter for posting that he tested positive for COVID, his symptoms were minimal, and he was going to work from home while isolating. And he got attacked for this, including from one person with a sizable following who said that Sanders and anyone with COVID who works from home should, quote, fuck off. So I jumped in to say that the response was a bit unhinged because, again, I'm a Twitter addict who never learns. And boy, did I poke a hornet's nest. Not going to waste your time with all the back and forth here, but if you want to go check out the PodSaveJon hashtag, you'll find out everything you need to know and don't want to know about this particular controversy. But I finally stopped engaging, at least on that topic. But the whole thing made me really want to do that episode we had been talking about on online COVID discourse. Not to relitigate my own Twitter drama, God help me, but to genuinely learn more about the fears and frustrations of people who are grappling with long COVID, and to understand why so much of the conversation about COVID on social media has been so toxic since the beginning of the pandemic. I thought Zeynep Tufekci would be the perfect person to talk to about this, since she's written so much about the pandemic and the social effects of technology. But before we get to that conversation, I also wanted to talk to someone who's living with long COVID. As it happens, our incredibly hardworking, fantastic offline producer, Emma, was willing to sit down with me and talk a bit about her experience dealing with long COVID. You'll hear that next, and then my conversation with Zeynep.
Before we get started,
No way.
I just get comfortable here.
That's so funny.
What did you put it? Is that on? Perfect.
John, unfortunately, I couldn't find any pictures of you crying
Look,
online.
that's my look like I'm crying face when I'm on cable and I don't know how to look.
NBC did you dirty on this thumbnail.
But they don't know. This is my fault. I always do that. This is my when you're sitting there and you're in a studio and you're not in person, I can't smile the whole time because I look like an idiot, but I don't want to look this, so I have this hangdog face. It's terrible.
Squidward.
Eyebrows.
It's amazing. That's amazing. Emma, welcome to the show that you produce offline.
Thank you. It's nice to be behind the mic.
Thank you for taking a break from being an amazing producer on the show to being a guest who's willing to share your experience on a topic that's not that fun, long COVID.
Yeah, anytime.
When did you first notice something was wrong? When did this start? When did you get COVID and then realize that you had a post-COVID condition, and just in general, what has it been like trying to get better?
So I first got COVID in February 2022. Okay. So it's my 2-year anniversary. Wow. And I started experiencing symptoms of long COVID about 2 to 3 weeks after I had fully gotten better. Mm-hmm. My case was, not especially mild, but not serious, like severe flu, laid in bed for a couple days, thought everything was fine. At this point,
vaccinated, obviously, booster, all that kind of stuff.
Of course, yeah. And so I really didn't expect, like 3 weeks after I was fully recovered, to start having terrible shortness of breath. And there was fatigue, there's chest pain. This has persisted for the last 2 years. And
every day?
Every day. Yeah, it's pretty continuous. Some days are better than others. Some weeks are better than others. And there's been very slow improvement. It's kind of been like 2 steps forward, 1 step back for a while. But it's changed my life in pretty tremendous ways, just in terms of what I'm able to do. For a while, it was really hard to get around. I was out of breath when I was just talking to people. I couldn't sing anymore, which sounds like a random thing, but if you're just driving along in the car and you can't sing along, it sucks. And so I felt really, really unlucky to have long COVID, but at the same time, there's so many people for whom the long COVID symptoms are so much worse, and they are just fully unable to live their lives and, hold down a job and get around. And so in some ways, I almost feel lucky. But the experience has just been one of absolute confusion and just really disheartening, like talking to doctors who have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, I was going to say, how was your experience with doctors and specialists?
Oh my God. Infuriating.
Yeah.
It's infuriating. And when I first started trying to get to the bottom of this, I had a little bit more grace for the doctors. It was 2 years ago. I was like, okay, the research isn't really there yet. And now it's 2024, and I'm still saying the research isn't really there yet. And I'm talking to primary care doctors who are like, I don't really know what to tell you. I don't know what's going on. And this would be really terrible for any kind of diagnosis, but long COVID is a diagnosis of elimination. So you have to do so many tests, and you have to go to so many appointments, and it's so expensive and time consuming, all for them to tell you, well, you don't have this, so you probably have long COVID.
No, I mean, I feel even luckier than you because I had COVID in, April of 2022. So a couple months after you. And then in early June, long after I had recovered, was getting rapid heartbeat, shortness of breath, anxiety attacks. Suddenly my doctor had done a physical and my thyroid was like going crazy. And I think about it. I mean, I'm recovered now, and I recovered after maybe 3-4 months. But I thought about what you just said, because I had to go to so many specialists and so many doctors, and they had to eliminate so many things. And while they're trying to eliminate things, they're like, well, there's a chance it could be thyroid cancer. The chance it could be this. And so now you're the anxiety of what it could be.
Terrifying.
Right. And then finally this top specialist at UCLA for thyroid stuff, he's like, you know what? I think this is a case of long COVID.
Yeah.
After they eliminated everything else, I'm like, oh, thanks. Well, now what do I do? It's like, well, hopefully it just goes away. And it did. I got lucky. But
that's great. That's great. I hope for everyone who's suffering from long COVID that that's in the future. But the unfortunate reality is, I think only about 7% of people who have long COVID after 2 years have returned to their pre-COVID baseline. That is so upsetting to me. I just the idea that I am never going to be able to breathe normally again is tragic.
What has the process been like? Because if you're not getting answers from doctors and specialists, what's your process been about getting information on potential new treatments, what to do, what you're going through?
Yeah, I hate to say this because for anyone who's listening to this who might have long COVID, my message to you is keep going, keep on chugging, keep trying to find answers. But for me, after about 6 months of concerted efforts and going to so many appointments, going to the pulmonologist, getting tested for asthma, ENT, methylcholine challenge, having this scan of my heart done, all of these things. And the answer is always, we don't know what to do. We don't have anything to tell you. And, turning to the internet and trying to find answers there is horrible.
Yes.
As anyone with a medical condition knows, the internet is just chock full of people screaming. You don't necessarily know what's true. The academic research is just not there yet. You know, every abstract ends with more research needed. This is inconclusive. We were only able to study this many people. We could only study them for 2 years. There are so many limitations. And so after those first 6 months of trying to get better and being told, we don't know what to do, you just need to wait, I was like, okay, I'm just going to wait, because that really feels like my only recourse here.
You said that you made some small improvement. Is that just... have you been doing anything to, there have been any treatments, or has that just been happening?
I was on a slew of different inhalers and drugs for the first year. And then I slowly stopped taking them because I felt like they weren't making any difference. And it didn't feel any different. So I don't know whether that helped me in my first year or not. I really don't think so. I try to do a lot of like intentional breathing, since that's what I am struggling with the most, in addition to the chest pain. But yoga, meditation, doing breathing exercises, I don't know if it's helping. That's the thing. Like you just don't know, because you are N1. You know, you can't compare yourself to someone else. But I think for me, the most helpful part of this has been believing myself that this is what I have. This diagnosis of elimination is valid. I have long COVID. And all of the medical professionals who have insinuated that this has to do with anxiety are being completely counterproductive and unprofessional, because if you can't breathe, of course you're going to be anxious.
Right.
And it's hard to tease those things out. But also, after 2 years of not being able to breathe, you can say with some certainty that it is not, it's not all in your mind.
No, and that's the trouble with an anxiety diagnosis on some of this stuff, is that anxiety is wrapped up in a lot of these conditions because the conditions produce anxiety.
Right, exactly.
And so the symptoms of anxiety can be seen as, well, maybe the whole thing's anxiety, but actually anxiety, like this is what happened to me with the thyroid thing. The anxiety, I was like having panic attacks.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, then maybe it's just anxiety.
No.
But you have the anxiety because there's an underlying condition.
Exactly. Yeah. It's such a catch-22.
Oh God. Well, I'm so sorry. If you're not going online, which I think is totally understandable why a lot of people want to go online and consume information about this.
And the support groups, the long COVID support groups.
Well, I was going to say, have you found communities of support or support groups like outside from the online world?
I've found it really, really helpful to talk to other people, not only who have long COVID, but who are just dealing with other chronic issues, because there is a way of communicating around these things that if you haven't experienced this kind of disabling event in your life, it's really hard for you to talk about this in a way that's like sympathetic or empathetic. So in preparation for this conversation, I talked to Jennifer Senior from The Atlantic and Angela Vasquez, who is from a long COVID support group, chronic illness support group that unfortunately shut down due to everyone leading it being really sick and really underfunded. I think that those conversations and conversations I have with my friends who have long COVID are the most helpful thing to me, because you have the validation and you have comparing notes, comparing doctors without having to wade into the morass of Twitter or other online spaces where nobody trusts each other's intentions, and there's so much anger. Yeah. And I understand why there's so much anger, because
totally understandable anger.
Folks who are disabled have just had the short end of the stick on pretty much everything for a really freaking long time, especially folks of color. They're not believed. They don't have platforms. And so, of course, these spaces are going to be so angry. But for me, it's so personal that I just can't. Yeah. I can't get into it. I can't read those things because it really upsets me.
Yeah. And it doesn't make you feel better.
It doesn't make me feel better.
Which is what you need to focus on.
I have a lot of things that I'm already dealing with.
Well, thank you for sharing it here, because I know it's not fun to talk about. Thank you for talking to some patients, some people who have it. We'll play those clips next. And then after that, we can get into my conversation with Zeynep Tufekci. So Emma, thanks you for joining.
Thank you for having me on.
Of course.
When I got reinfected, I talked to 4 people who are all highly regarded, and I had a hung jury. I had 2 and 2. 2 said I should take Paxlovid, and 2 said I should leave it alone. That's just about Paxlovid. I mean, that's just about the most basic tool that there is, right? That doesn't even address any of the other bullshit that you and I might contend with on a daily basis, which are separate, but nonetheless, extremely life compromising and soul crushing. So, I mean, it's not unlike when you're having work done on your house and a contractor comes in and goes, "Oh, that last guy did it like shit." And that's what I feel like my doctors do. "Oh, they said that. Terrible idea. I never would have prescribed that." And it's what am I supposed to do here?
I would say living with long COVID in America is lonely, devastating, and still resilient. I say all that because I think it's really hard to feel, especially now, 4 years after getting sick, feeling like our country has been made to make a false choice between, quote, getting back to normal and caring for disabled and high-risk people.
Zeynep Tufekci, welcome to Offline.
Thank you for inviting me.
You have done so much great writing and reporting on both the pandemic and the internet, so I couldn't imagine anyone better to have this conversation with. And since your most recent New York Times piece is about your trip to the first ever Senate hearing on long COVID, let's start there. What did you learn at the hearing, and what was your big takeaway?
I would say the biggest takeaway from the hearing I had was how much sympathy and potential for, dare I say it, bipartisan progress there might actually be for long COVID, because contrary to the sort of the impression you might get from just looking at online polarization or the other things, there are people with long COVID who are related to high-profile Republicans. That's what I learned at the hearing. I went to the hearing thinking, I would hear a lot more sympathetic phrasing and words from the Democrats, and that the Republicans perhaps might have been skeptical or might have been pushed back. I just didn't know what to expect. And I knew the people who had helped make the hearings happen by pressuring for it, they lean more Democrats. They were from, more big cities, more Democratic cities. So that's what I was thinking I would find. But when the Republican senators started speaking, the co-chair immediately passed it to Republican Senator Marshall from Kansas, and he just went right into it because he apparently has a loved one very close to him who's severely debilitated by long COVID. And he just came out and said it, and he was just as frustrated and angry and lost as the activists themselves. So you had this very surprising, perhaps, moment where these activists, most of them were more liberal leaning and were using what you would associate with, liberal language, were applauding the Republican junior senator from Kansas as he very harshly, and in my view correctly, criticized the NIH for wasting a lot of time and money. There was this kind of alliance that reminded you that illness doesn't always strike according to party ID, which we knew, but that it could lead to these kinds of moments. And it made me also realize how much of the COVID conversation, parts of it are extremely polarized and weird and also, not very nice along particular political lines, but that's not completely the experience of the country.
In what ways are we closer to understanding what causes people to get long COVID and how we might treat the condition?
I would have to say that's part of the problem, is that it's not very clearly defined. It has subsets. So it's not one thing, right? The CDC and WHO are defining it as people having symptoms according to the CDC, or 12 weeks according to WHO, still having symptoms or new symptoms. So this is such a broad definition. It's not what does this mean, right? Is it just a lingering cough, or is it just sort of something that might debilitate people, or what is it? So when you look at the epidemiology and what we know of it, there seems to be bunch of things going on. One of them is people who had very severe illness. This is a lot of 2020 people who got very sick. They were hospitalized. A lot of those people were older and perhaps they had other health issues. And for them, it was a hard hit to be hospitalized for it. You had the virus and you had the hospitalization. And in some ways, these people represent a similar subset to other people who have severe illness. It takes a while to bounce back. And for elderly people or people whose health already wasn't in a great condition, it can never, sometimes people just never bounce back completely to where they were. There's other people for whom you have some set of people who seem to have what we would call, broad post-viral fatigue or, just malaise or you see that with influenza. You see this with a lot of other things, right? You had an illness. It takes a few months for your body to bounce back. So that's, and a lot of those people do get better 3 months, 6 months down the line. Now, the group that was in the Senate hearing and the group that really desperately needs help and is not getting the help they need and that our understanding is not sufficiently far along are people who are really severely debilitated in the sense they can't get out of bed, they can't get out of their house, and they are in pain. They have all sorts of baffling symptoms. And a lot of these people were very young people. They did not necessarily even have very severe illness. So something about the virus set off something in their immune system reaction, something in their body. And that part is not only not understood, it seems to connect to a bunch of other illnesses before the pandemic. I'm not saying it's identical, but there are a lot of symptom overlap that suggests there's something similar that people used to call MECFS. Still called MECFS, which were also very baffling, but kind of not taken very seriously by the medical establishment because it's so baffling and, you don't have a biomarker. But now we have a bunch of these people who have become that sick with the pandemic. And that's really tragic in a significant way because there's no FDA approved or, reliable treatments. This is what Republican Senator too was really mad about is the NIH is not really running clinical trials for these people. And a lot of these people, were young people at they're very active people. I have met a lot of them because I've been writing about this. I have interviewed maybe hundreds of them. These people had very active, very full lives that, going about their business and they get this illness and a lot of them don't even have very severe illness. And then boom, their life as they knew it is gone.
Well, do we have good estimates on how many people in the United States are in that group that you just talked about?
So that's another great question because like many things about this, the research is not very high quality because you have this very weird, vague definition. And when you have surveys and you ask people, do you have something new that you didn't have before COVID? And you define it as minor as a little fatigue, lingering cough, you get really wildly differing numbers, right? Depending on how you count. So what I look at to try to understand the numbers here is there are two things. When people ask about the long COVID in surveys, and I look at the numbers, I try to see if they ask them if it interferes with their life, right? So when you ask people, do you have something that you didn't have before COVID? And if it has no impact on their life, they're saying, that doesn't sound to me like a severe illness, right? Like maybe they're just mildly annoyed by something transient, but zero impact on their life. Whereas if they're saying it's like severe impact, there's something here. When you look at that in the United Kingdom, they used to have a really good survey. They kind of stopped for a while, and you had about 0.5% of the population, 0.6% or so, reporting really severe effects, like significantly affecting their life from long COVID. That was about, they stopped a year ago. In the United States, you have something called the Household Pulse Survey from the CDC. And in that one, we have about 1.5% of the population reporting that they have significant activity limitations that they ascribe to having had COVID. And if you look at like France had a survey like that, and I think they had about 1.2% of the population. So assuming that this is a ballpark number, Because as I said, there might be some overestimation because some of it stuff that would have happened, but there might also be underestimation because some people just might not realize what they have is connected to COVID. So assuming a ballpark, you get from 0.6 in UK to 1.5 that was released last week, 1.5% of the population in the United States self-reporting significant levels of disruption to their life from long COVID. And I mean, that might sound small.
330 million people. That's a big number.
That is a very large number. You're also seeing an uptick of things like cognitive impairment, perhaps like 1 million new young people post-pandemic in the CPS, the census survey, are reporting cognitive impairment. But if you sort of drill down to significantly affected, in my best estimate, that's a very substantial number for the sort of the illness, because it's a very severe, debilitating illness, that category, for the people who have it, with a huge loss of quality of life and no approved treatments. And that's kind of why I'm so animated when talking about it, because as we have seen, for most people, they don't think about the pandemic anymore.
Right.
They moved on with their lives, but these people cannot move on with their lives. And nobody wants to sort of talk about it in a sensible way. And they're very ill. And unlike the AIDS patients in the early 90s, they're too ill to go what the AIDS patients at the time did, which was, they busted FDA meetings. They threw ashes of dead people at the White House fence. They poured blood on politicians. But that requires a certain level of physical fitness that these AIDS patients had before they had full-blown AIDS. There's a lot of the sickest, they're just too ill to do that. And so they need people who are not sick to speak up for them, which is why that Senate hearing, co-chaired by Bernie Sanders, who was very sympathetic, but his Republican co-chair, Senator Cassidy, he was a medical doctor. He was super sympathetic too. And he asked really good questions. So I kept thinking, there's an alternative planet somewhere where the Senate does something. So I realized that's not what the planet looks like. But for a brief couple-hour period, I was just sitting there thinking, this is an interesting alternative planet where maybe they will get together and, pass some sensible legislation to try to get help for these people.
Well, it's really heartening because, since the beginning of the pandemic, I followed the conversation about COVID and long COVID online, mostly on Twitter. And I'm torn about it. On one hand, I think these online spaces can give people, and especially people who are suffering or vulnerable, a sense of community and a chance to be heard and a chance to advocate for themselves and their community. On the other, you see a lot of misinformation, hyperbole, outright aggression that I worry isn't really helping anyone, and most importantly, not helping the patients themselves. I know you follow these debates too. What's your impression been of? You
shouldn't have asked me that question, because I'm just gonna breathe fire. Because of course, I broadly agree, but I really put the blame on the medical authorities and the NIH and the CDC, to be honest, because if you leave very sick people to their own devices and without treatments, and without even proper acknowledgement, right? And their only way of connecting to one another is online. Of course, they're going to just connect with each other online, which is, perfectly fine. But what you have happen is that a large number of people, who are not sick and who are just riding an online wave, they're like influencers, prey on these people. And, if you're really sick and nobody's talking about you, and you have these people who are the only ones talking about you on, Twitter, and some of them, look credentialed. They have PhDs, they have MDs, some of them have published a thing or two, and they're saying stuff that sounds like they care about you, and they're the only people speaking for you, right? What happens is I think these communities are being preyed on by these what we would have called cranks, grifters, and influencers. Some of them are genuinely peddling stuff like, here's my super duper COVID blah, link in bio people. Like there's a bunch of people who constantly claim that like everybody's sick and immune systems are, widely damaged by COVID. And when you look at actual numbers or statistics, or if you just step out in any big city or look at, economic data or the Federal Reserve or anything, you know this is not true. That's not true. And the people who are lying about it know this is not true. But the patients who are very sick and for whom life is very hard, they don't necessarily know what's true or not about these claims. And I think the online part has gotten really terrible because they're taking a marginalized community and using them to just peddle influence or, get followers.
One thing in particular I've noticed is that online discussions about long COVID include a lot of people who, for lack of a better description, use hashtags like zero COVID, COVID is airborne. They compare COVID to AIDS in the way that the actual virus attacks the body. They some of them say that COVID is worse than AIDS. They accuse people of eugenics, and it's a tough thing because I feel like there is the zero COVID sort of community. They have and whether it's a genuine belief or whether they're peddling something or whatever else, their belief is if we are more restrictionist and have more COVID restrictions now, and that those restrictions are universal, then that will help people who either have long COVID or are susceptible to long COVID. And that's sort of a belief that is separate from the fact that there are millions of people in this country who are suffering from long COVID who need treatment that might not necessarily have to do with what the COVID restrictionists and zero COVID people are advocating for on Twitter all the time.
So I'm going to blame the authorities again. This is my favorite thing. So here's the thing. Let's take COVID is airborne. Mm-hmm. So something else I was really involved in early on, because when I started writing about the pandemic, one of the things I read, as did everybody, was like, okay, it's transmitted through droplets which fall to the ground. And I started looking into it, and then there was a very complicated, long story in which I actually ended up co-authoring pieces in Lancet and other places, which is not usually as my usual hangouts, because I can do the causal inference in epidemiology. So I plugged into the efforts of aerosol engineers and others who try to make the case that, it is airborne. It is like this droplet stuff is incorrect. And we even had like really fun papers that trace why these beliefs emerged and why the medical establishment was incorrect. And they were doing like WHO, and they were literally labeling COVID as airborne as misinformation. So they were like fact checking us. Now, obviously there's a lot of nonsense and what you might call misinformation, but if you start wielding misinformation as a tool for whatever objection you encounter, then you essentially are, in fact, disempowering any effort to oppose misinformation. So there's a large number of people who became very disappointed with the CDC, with the WHO, over this airborne debacle, where they have kind of blatantly conceded, but like the WHO still won't say the word properly. CDC has moved along far better, but so you've gone through this where you've lost trust in authorities. Okay. You have people like me who are saying, well, listen to the CDC and WHO, but not on this. That's a very weird thing to say. Yeah. Like that is not, I hate being in that position, but because that's what a lot of anti-vaxxers do. Don't listen to them on this, right? So, but we were, in this particular case, it was a scientific dissent within science, which they labeled as misinformation. So a lot of people have lost trust in them. So there they come along, and they've lost trust in CDC, and they've lost trust in WHO, and the establishment in some ways, and they don't know what to believe. So somebody comes and says COVID damages, is mass damaging the immune system. Like, they're not in a position to evaluate this claim, right? They can't really in a position to understand it, but they have lost trust in the people who would normally reassure you about this, because there are examples of other things in which they were incorrect and just kind of gaslit people, right? If you gaslight people once, you lose a lot of trust. And that's what happened. I've spoken to so many immunologists. When they try to correct these things on Twitter, they get harassed. Sometimes they get harassed by the patients who are being instigated by these liars, grifters, and cranks, right? So in one particular case, which I won't name the academic, but it's kind of findable. There was this person who first discovered how HIV enters the T cell. Like, if you want somebody who understands the immune system damage from viruses, this is your person. He was doing work on both long COVID patients and ME/CFS patients, and he said in his cohort, they're not even seeing some significant immune damage with their clinical profiles, and they're not seeing it on population level. So he says this to me in our answer, and this bunch of crazy, cranky grifter people start attacking this guy. And I'm like, are you all out of your mind? Like, if you need an ally in this is world's top foremost actual authority on this. And you guys are listening to some online weirdo influencer who is harassing him so bad that he's like, I'm not going to talk about this online anymore. And some of the harassment towards him came from the patients. And I keep going to these very sort of high-level immunologists who encounter this and say, please don't blame the patients. Like, there are few of them, they don't represent all the sick people, and they're lost and angry, and they're being told lies day in and day out from people. Some of them claim expertise. They don't have it. They claim it. It's Twitter. You can claim whatever you want, right? So like, you can claim anything. So they claim this, and these people feel abandoned. So this is the tricky thing. So this is why I think the answer to these online problems, like many things, is for the institutions that are supposed to do the kind of speaking to us and reassure us to gain our trust. Like, it is ridiculous. And, same with masks. Like, the mask debate kind of got out of hand because, like, it's not because masks are some magical tools, but they do work to some degree on some circumstances, and they work less well under, depends on fit, depends on the contagiousness, depends on what the trade-offs are. I still have people, very weirdly, sometimes on different sides of the spectrum, I get these like hit pieces on me, and sometimes I'm a, mask lunatic, and sometimes I'm an anti-mask person, according to these hit pieces, which none of which are, like, it's sort of absurd. But there's this online churn it's like content churn. Which is, I think, because people, we need our institutions to work way better than this, because you can't push back on this if people don't trust the authority that they're supposed to be trusting. And we're a country where a quarter of the population doesn't have a primary care provider. So who are they going to ask that they trust, right? They don't have a medical professional that they have a relationship with, so they go online, and it's that's no way to be informed.
No, I mean, I think your point about trust is at the heart of this, and it's sort of why I've followed this debate so closely and been fascinated by it, just because it is perhaps one of the most salient examples of institutions that are sort of older and also like not communicating in the way that people expect communication in 2024 or 2020 at the time. And online spaces, they don't do nuance. They don't do complicated answers. They don't do answers that change with conditions over time. Everything is black or white, right? Which is why you're either a crazy mask lunatic or an anti-masker, or you can be both. And to your trust point, also, a lot of people, when they're having fights about COVID online, all they have to do is either, point to someone who has a big Twitter following, like you said, has a postgraduate degree in their bio, has published something somewhere, even if it's just like one article that you see somewhere online. I mean, to me, it's like when you go to the doctor and the doctor's like, yeah, don't Google this condition. I will, we're going to take some tests and I'll tell you. It's like Googling. It's like Googling your condition on steroids, because you're online, you're in social media, and everyone has their view. They are all revved up. It's more polarizing. People are like pushed into camps. And it's just I think it's a really difficult way to both gain understanding about these conditions and diseases and viruses, but it's also tough because if you don't have institutions that are communicating frequently and with humility, then you're going to lose that trust and not get it back. I'm wondering, like, what you think, like, going forward, some of these institutions like CDC and NIH should do, both on the, like, just long COVID research side, but then also on communicating with the public so that next time we have a pandemic or next time we have a big health crisis, there's more trust in the system than there is, and fewer people just looking online for all the answers.
Yeah. So part of the thing is, like, in your scenario, for the long COVID people, they go to the doctor and doctor just dismisses them. So
that's a huge problem.
So one thing that I think that was really good about the Senate hearing is that all the senators basically said, we hear you. You exist, you're very sick, and you deserve help. And a lot of the people that I talked to afterwards, they're almost like so happy just to have heard, elected officials just look at them and say, we hear you. You need help and you're sick. Because many of them have, history of going to doctors and being dismissed. And like a lot of autoimmune illnesses are more women than men. In women and men, they have different immune systems. It's a long, well-established thing. So you can imagine it's even made worse by the fact that you have, you don't have the biomarker, and you have a lot of women, and that's even more dismissive from the medical establishment. So the acknowledgement is the first thing. And the second thing I think that really matters is, like, competence. Increasingly in the United States, our public institutions are not able to really execute. And it's not because of lack of resources. We are one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and we've done okay after the pandemic economically, relatively speaking. To give you an example, at the end of 2020, Congress allocated about $1.15 billion to NIH to research long COVID, which is not a small number. And the money started being used right after the Biden administration. So there's not something you can blame on Trump either. In 3 years, they have launched 2 clinical trials. We're 3 years in. And they had $1 billion. And of the 2 clinical trials, one of them is Paxlovid, which is so late that there are 1, 2, 3, at least 3 other trials. 2 of them are almost already done. They might as well give the money back almost. Wow. So this is one. The second one, the only other trial they have launched this is going to get worse, looks at, there's significant cognitive impairment for a lot of people with long COVID. And it's like significant. I don't mean, I can't remember a few words. It's like, I can't read more than 5 minutes. It's really severe, some people. So they need research into this. So what does the NIH decide? Their second and only other trial is going to be online brain training of a program by a for-profit San Francisco tech-ish kind of company that's already available. This is literally online brain training system that's already available there. That's number one. The second component is, I'm not kidding, Zoom therapy to help people better manage plans and goals. Okay. And the third component of their alleged neurological trial is transcranial zapping devices, which are already available on Amazon. I'm sure you can trial them, but these are available on Amazon. Meanwhile, this is NIH with $1 billion. Meanwhile, just a month ago, I was in Amsterdam and I talked to Rob Wurst, who's a exercise scientist, who was really intrigued by some of the very baffling reports he was hearing about something called post-exertional malaise, where exertion makes people feel even worse, which is really goes against everything we know about exercise. So he was intrigued and he started looking into it. And he did these muscle biopsy studies, which are groundbreaking. Like he's as close to as I've seen as like finding very significant biomarkers. It's very high quality, got published in Nature, exactly what the patients need. And he had so little money to do this that he basically begged his pathologist surgeon friends who came on a Saturday. And because he couldn't even afford postdocs, he just like, quote unquote, got some interns with master's degrees to do some of the analysis. Like he was literally, stitching together pennies, volunteers, Saturday, free office space. And he published like a groundbreaking study. On tiny little money. And the rest of the money he got from a foundation that is led mostly by patients, but a few other people that got most of his money from like, I think 10, 20 million with an M. And some of it is like a donation from a crypto billionaire. Like they're outdoing the NIH by, you see what I'm saying? This is ridiculous. Like if you've got a crypto billionaire's disposable excess cash that grateful for, but like this is ridiculous. But we're talking like small amounts of money. And then the patients who suffer from significant cognitive impairment are funding trials and research that is leading to real research, while NIH is taking $1 billion and is trialing Zoom therapy. If that works, these people they're not like everybody's tried these things. This level of lack of executive, and nobody's holding them accountable. Like I have talked to NIH officials before, and I'm hoping the new leadership changes. But I talked to one of them that's leading this long COVID billion in summer of 2022, and he told me on the record, and I wrote it in the New York Times, trials are imminent. That was like 18 months ago. And I just saw an interview with the same person on the record, again, USA Today 2024. These patients are very sick. And same response, imminent. We're about to do a lot more. But, we are slow because we must get things right. And like very condescending to the patients, to be honest. Like we're slow because we're doing things right and you don't understand science. And when I interview these people, like, I have like not particular person, but I have encountered, almost gaslighting. They like, blah, 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 we're doing this. But hey, look, you know what? I do statistics and causal inference. I read that protocol. So I go back to them and say, well, excuse me, that's not how your power calculation works. And I make a very technical point that they're trying to gaslight me on. And at that point, they go, oh, okay, she knows what she's talking about. And then they start sort of backpedaling. Now, this has happened to me again and again, which is very discouraging because even though I'm a columnist, I'm not a regular journalist. I'm an academic. I publish statistical stuff myself, so I can push back. But you see what they're doing. They're super defensive about their incompetence and foot dragging. And when you try to say something to them, they act like you're just a misinformed person who doesn't understand science. And then, okay, why are people mad at us? Why are people like, this is why people are mad and angry. So my 2 cents here is that I think there has been this tendency to blame Trump for a lot of things that he deserved blame for, like 100%. 100% deserved blame for. But it has become a way in which we have left our institutions that should be working better off the hook. So when people sort of say something critical of the NIH, and they say something critical of the CDC, when they say something critical of NIH leadership, we turn into, trust the science, you anti-science crazies mode. And sometimes that is who they are.
Yeah.
But there's a way in which the people on the side of science, on the side of functioning institutions, on the side of functioning democracy should be screaming from the rooftops about failures that were not due to Trump.
This has been a problem all throughout the Trump era since 2016, is if we're going to be, and we should be, the defenders of democratic institutions, we have to prove that those institutions can work. And when they don't work, we have to be honest about why they don't work, and we have to fix them, because trust becomes the most important thing you have as a bulwark against the appeals of a strongman or authoritarianism.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, like, when I sort of talk about some of these things, like, I get pushback. Like, I mean, I want the NIH to be better. I'm an academic. Like, of course I want, the premier basic science funding institution in the world, perhaps, to do much better. But there's a lot of criticisms of it that are not incorrect.
Yeah.
And there has to be a way in which we can be within the tent and say things. So again, to go back to our examples of the appropriate uses of masks, COVID airborne, all of those things, there was a way in which I became like a loud spokesperson for some of those topics, partly because there weren't sufficient number of people within those, more established institutions that would do that. I became a voice of certain things, not because I was saying things that were super controversial, if you looked at the data and evidence and science and all of that, but because other people whose voice should have been there were not speaking out.
Yeah.
Because these institutions, I think, and the way we sort of circle the wagons have made it very hard for them to have voice within the supportive framework. So they just choose silence. You see what I'm saying? This is the classic exit voice loyalty thing. They just don't say anything. And every time I write one of these pieces, I would get all these emails from very high-level people in these fields saying, thank you for writing this. And I was like, you're welcome, but why aren't you writing this? Could I introduce you to... Yeah, I'm genuinely serious. I would try again and again to get these people to be the voice for this rather than me. Like, I want to... I write about tech, society, AI. I'm not short on topics. Like, I'm not really... I really am not short on topics. I would very happily hand it off to people with the right kind of PhD, with the right kind of, institutional credential, who I know would be able to say this. And I offered to help them sort of, write for the public. Like, if that was the problem, I'm like, I will work with you. Their editors will work for you. And I would hear again and again, oh, I don't want to do that. That leads to circling the wagons. And this is, I think, the head of the CDC, current CDC, the head of the NIH. We have new leadership, so they have a chance here. And I'm really hoping that, besides being great scientists, they understand the sociological moment that they need to go fight for people's trust. And the number one rule is like competency. It's like people bring up transparency, but you know what? If you make things work, that's going to count for a lot. And transparency is great, but you really have to be competent. If something's not, like, if there's a competence problem, you have to figure that out and fix that. These are not easy things, but so to your the online craziness, I think it comes from that failure.
Yeah. No. Well, look, for as counterproductive as it can be, I am very glad that a lot of that advocacy led to the hearing, and that the hearing was so hopeful, and hopefully something comes out of that, and there's actually action from Democrats and Republicans to push these institutions. And I'm really glad that you went and you wrote about it. And thank you for coming on to chat with me about it. I appreciate it.
No, of course.
All right, Zeynep, thank you so much for joining. I appreciate the time.